Hello, friends. This is Chapter 2 of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, just in case some of you may have missed our last club and missed this chapter. I'm going to be uploading every chapter that we read every week onto my YouTube channel so that you can go on and listen to any chapters that you may have missed. Okay? So, Chapter 2, The Vanishing Glass. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursleys had woken up to find their nephew on the front step, but Privet Drive had hardly changed at all. The sun rose on the same tidy front gardens and lit up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into their living room, which was almost exactly the same as it had been on the night Mr. Dursley had seen that fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantelpiece really showed how much time had passed. 10 years ago there had been lots of pictures of what looked like a large pink beach ball wearing different colored bobble hats, but Dudley Dursley was no longer a baby. And now the photographs showed a large, blond boy riding his first bicycle on a roundabout at the fair, playing a computer game with his father, being hugged and kissed by his mother. The room held no sign at all that another boy lived in the house, too. Yet Harry Potter was still there, asleep at the moment, but not for long. His Aunt Petunia was awake, and it was her shrill voice which made the first noise of the day. "Up! Get up! Now!" she said. Harry woke with a start. His aunt rapped on the door again. "Up!" she screeched. Harry heard her walking towards the kitchen door, and then the sound of a frying pan being put on the cooker. He rolled back onto his back and tried to remember the dream he had been having. It had been a good one. There had been a flying motorbike in it. He had a funny feeling he'd had the same dream before. "Are you up yet?" Aunt Petunia demanded. "Nearly," said Harry. "Well, get a move on. I want you to look after the bacon, and don't you dare let it burn. I want everything perfect on my Duddy's birthday." Harry groaned. "What did you say?" she said. "Nothing, nothing. Dudley's birthday. How could he have forgotten?" Harry got slowly out of bed and started looking for socks. He found a pair under his bed, and after pulling a spider off of one of them, he put them on. Harry was used to spiders because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that was where he slept. When he was dressed, he went down the hall into the kitchen. The table was almost hidden beneath all of Dudley's birthday presents. It looked as though Dudley had gotten the new computer he wanted, not to mention a second television and a racing bike. Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise, unless of course it involved punching someone. Dudley's favorite punch bag was Harry, but he couldn't often catch him. Harry didn't look it, but he was very fast. Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard, but Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he was in real life because he had to wear all of Dudley's old clothes, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together with a lot of sellotape, because of all the times Dudley had punched him on the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead which was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it as long as he could remember, and the first question he could ever remember asking Aunt Petunia was where he got it. "In that car crash when your parents died," she had said, "and don't ask questions." Don't ask questions. That was the first rule for a quiet life with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon entered the kitchen as Harry was turning over the bacon. "Comb your hair," he barked, by way of a morning greeting. About once a week, Uncle Vernon looked over the top of his newspaper and shouted that Harry needed another haircut. Harry must have had more haircuts than the rest of the boys in his class put together, but it made no difference. His hair simply grew that way, just all over the place. Harry was frying eggs by the time Dudley arrived in the kitchen with his mother. Dudley looked like a lot like Uncle Vernon. He had a large pink face, not much neck, small watery blue eyes, and thick blonde hair that laid smoothly on his thick fat head. Aunt Petunia often said that Dudley looked like a baby angel. Harry often said that Dudley looked like a pig in a wig. Harry put the plates of eggs and bacon on the table, which was difficult as there wasn't much room. Dudley, meanwhile, was counting all of his presents. His face fell. "36," he said. "That's 2 less than last year." "Darling, you haven't counted Auntie Marge's present. See, here it is under the big one from Mummy and Daddy." "All right, then, 37," said Dudley, going red in the face. Harry, who could see that a huge Dudley tantrum was coming on, began wolfing down his bacon as fast as possible in case Dudley turned the table over. Aunt Petunia obviously scented danger too, because she said quickly, "Oh, and we'll buy you another 2 presents while we're out today. How's that, Popkin?" "2 more presents, all right." Dudley thought for a moment. It looked like hard work. Finally, he said slowly, "So I'll have 39 sweetums," said Aunt Petunia. Uncle Vernon chuckled. "Little Tykes wants his money worth, just like his father. Attaboy, Dudley," he said, and ruffled Dudley's hair. At that moment the telephone rang, and Aunt Petunia went to answer it, while Harry and Uncle Vernon watched Dudley unwrap the racing bike, a cine camera, a remote-control airplane, 16 new games, and a video recorder. He was ripping the paper off of a gold wristwatch when Aunt Petunia came back from the telephone looking both angry and worried. "Bad news, Vernon," she said. "Mrs. Figg's broken her leg, and she can't take him." She jerked her head in Harry's direction. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and his friends out for the day, to adventure parks, hamburger bars, or the cinema. Every year, Harry was left behind with Mrs. Figg, a mad old lady who lived 2 streets away. Here's a photo of Harry, poor thing, in the cupboard under the stairs. Poor Harry. Harry hated it there. The whole house smelled of cabbage, and Mrs. Figg made him look at photographs of all the cats she'd ever had. "Now what?" said Aunt Petunia, looking furiously at Harry, as though he had planned for this. Harry knew he ought to feel sorry that Mrs. Figg had broken her leg, but he couldn't help to think that it would be a whole year before he had to look at Tibbles or Snowy or Mr. Paws or Tufty again. "We could phone Marge," Uncle Vernon suggested. "Don't be silly, Vernon. She hates that boy." The Dursleys often spoke about Harry like this, as though he wasn't there, or rather, as if he was something very nasty that couldn't understand them, like a slug. "What about what's-her-name, your friend, Yvonne?" "She's on holiday in Majorca," snapped Aunt Petunia. "You could just leave me here," said Harry. He'd be able to watch what he wanted on TV for a change, and maybe even have a go on Dudley's computer. Aunt Petunia looked at him as though she'd just swallowed a lemon. "And come back to find the house in ruins?" she said. "I won't blow up the house," said Harry, but they weren't listening. "I suppose we could take him to the zoo," said Aunt Petunia slowly, "and just leave him in the car?" "That car's new. He's not sitting in there alone," said Mr. Dursley. Dudley began to cry loudly. In fact, he wasn't really crying. It had been years since he had really cried. But he knew that if he screwed up his face and wailed, his mother would give him anything that he wanted. "Dinky Duddy-Dums, don't cry. Mummy won't let him spoil your special day," she cried, flinging her arms around him. "I don't want him to come," Dudley yelled between huge pretend sobs. "He always spoils everything." He shot Harry a nasty grin through the gap in his mother's arms. Just then the doorbell rang. "Oh, good Lord, they're here," said Aunt Petunia frantically, and a moment later Dudley's best friend, Piers Polkiss, walked in with his mother. Piers was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat. He was usually the one who held people's arms behind their backs while Dudley hit them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry all at once. Half an hour later, Harry, who couldn't believe his luck, was sitting in the back of the Dursleys' car with Piers and Dudley, on the way to the zoo for the first time in his life. His aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything else to do with him, but before they left, Uncle Vernon took him to the side. "I'm warning you," he said, putting his large purple face right up to Harry's. "I'm warning you now, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in that cupboard from now till Christmas." "I'm not going to do anything," said Harry. "Honestly." But Uncle Vernon didn't believe him. No, no one ever did. The problem was, strange things often did happen around Harry, and it was just no good telling the Dursleys he didn't have anything to do with it. Once, Aunt Petunia, tired of Harry coming back from the barber's looking as though he hadn't had a haircut at all, took a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short that he was almost bald, except for his fringe, which she left to hide that horrible scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, who spent a sleepless night imagining school the next day, where he was already laughed at for his baggy clothes and his sellotaped glasses. Next morning, however, he got up to find his hair exactly as it had been before Aunt Petunia took the shears to him. He had been given a week in his cupboard for that, even though he tried to explain that he couldn't explain how his hair had grew back so quickly. Another time, Aunt Petunia had been trying to force him into a revolting old jumper of Dudley's, which was brown with orange baubles. The harder she tried to pull it over his head, the smaller it seemed to become, until it finally might have fitted a glove puppet, but it certainly wouldn't fit Harry. Aunt Petunia decided it must have shrunk in the wash, and to his great relief, Harry wasn't punished. On the other hand, he'd gotten into terrible trouble for being found on the roof of the school kitchens once. Dudley's gang had been chasing him as usual, when, as much to Harry's surprise as any, there he was, sitting on the chimney. The Dursleys received a very angry letter from Harry's headmistress, telling them that Harry had been climbing on the school buildings. But all he tried to do, as he shouted at Uncle Vernon through the locked door of the cupboard, was jump behind the big bins outside the kitchen door. Harry supposed that the wind just must have caught him mid-jump. But today, nothing was going to go wrong. It was even worth being with Dudley and Piers to be spending the day somewhere that wasn't school or the cupboard. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He liked to complain about things. People at work, Harry, the council, Harry, the bank, and Harry were just a few of his favorite subjects. This morning, it was motorbikes. Roaring along like maniacs, that young hoodlum, he said, as a motorbike overtook them. I had a dream about a motorbike, said Harry. It was flying. Uncle Vernon nearly crashed into the car in front of them. He turned right around in his seat and yelled at Harry, Motorbikes don't fly. Dudley and Piers sniggered. I know they don't, said Harry. It was just a dream. But he wished he hadn't said anything. If there was one thing that the Dursleys hated even more than asking questions, it was his talking about anything acting a way it shouldn't, no matter if it was in a dream or a cartoon or whatever. They seemed to think he might get dangerous ideas just talking about it. It was a very sunny Saturday, and the zoo was crowded with families. The Dursleys bought Dudley and Piers large ice creams at the entrance, and then, because the smiling lady in the van asked what Harry wanted, before they could hurry him away, they bought him a cheap lemon ice lolly. It wasn't that bad either, Harry thought, licking it as they watched the gorilla scratching its head and looking remarkably like Dudley, except that it wasn't blonde. Harry had the best morning he'd had in a very long time. He was careful to walk a little way apart from the Dursleys, so that Dudley and Piers, who were starting to get bored with the animals by lunchtime, wouldn't fall back onto their favorite hobby of hitting him. They ate in the zoo restaurant, and when Dudley had a tantrum because his Knickerbocker glory wasn't big enough, Uncle Vernon bought him another one, and Harry was allowed to finish the first. Harry felt afterwards that he should have known it was all too good to last. After lunch, they went to a reptile house. It was cool and dark in there, with lit windows all along the walls. Behind the glass, all sorts of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering over bits of wood and stone. Dudley and Piers wanted to see huge poisonous cobras and thick man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickly found the largest snake in the place. It could have wrapped its body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a dustbin, but at that moment, it didn't look like it was in the mood. It was fast asleep. Dudley stood with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coils. Make it move, he whined to his father. Uncle Vernon tapped the glass, but the snake didn't budge. Do it again, Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon rapped the glass smartly with his knuckles, but the snake just snoozed on. This is boring, moaned Dudley, and shuffled away. Harry moved in front of the tank and looked intently at the snake. He wouldn't have been surprised if it died of boredom itself. No company except stupid people drumming their fingers on the glass trying to disturb it all day long. It was worse than having a cupboard as a bedroom, where he had an only visitor was Aunt Petunia hammering on the door to wake you up. That's all pictures of Dudley and the gorilla and Dudley. At least he got to visit the rest of the house. The snake suddenly opened its beady eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until its eyes were on level with Harry's. It winked. Harry stared, Then he looked quickly around to see if anyone was watching. They weren't. He looked back at the snake and winked too. The snake jerked its head toward Uncle Vernon and Dudley, and then raised its eyes as if to say, "I get that all the time." "I know," Harry murmured through the glass. "It must be really annoying." The snake nodded vigorously. "Where do you come from, anyway?" Harry asked. The snake jabbed its tail at the little sign next to the glass. Harry peered at it. "Boa constrictor, Brazil." "Was it nice there?" The boa constrictor jabbed its tail at the sign again, and Harry read on. "This specimen was bred in a zoo." "Oh, I see. So you've never been to Brazil?" The boa constrictor shook its head. A deafening sound behind Harry made both of them jump. "Dudley! Mr. Dursley! Come, look at this snake! You won't believe what it's doing!" Dudley came waddling towards them as fast as he could. "Out of the way, you!" he said, punching Harry in the ribs. Caught by surprise, Harry fell hard on the concrete floor. What came next happened so fast no one saw how it happened. 1 second, Pierce and Dudley were leaning right up close to the glass, and the next they had leapt backwards in howls of horror. Harry sat up and gasped. The glass front of the boa constrictor's tank vanished. The great snake was uncoiling itself rapidly, slithering out onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running for the exits. As the snake slid swiftly past him, Harry could have sworn he heard in a low, hissing voice say, "Brazil, here I come. Thanks, amigo." The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. But the glass," he kept saying. "Where did the glass go?" The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a cup of strong, sweet tea while he apologized over and over again. As far as Harry had seen, the snake hadn't done anything except snap playfully at Dudley at their heels as it passed, but by the time they were all back in Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling them how it had nearly bitten off his leg, while Piers swore it had tried to squeeze him to death. But worst of all, for Harry at least, was Piers calming down enough to say, "And Harry was talking to it, weren't you, Harry?" Harry talking to the snake. Uncle Vernon waited until Piers was safely out of the house before starting on Harry. He was so angry he could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Go, cupboard, stay, no meals," before he collapsed into the chair, and Aunt Petunia had to run and get him a large brandy. Harry lay in his dark cupboard much later, wishing that he had a watch. He didn't know what time it was, and he couldn't be sure the Dursleys were asleep yet. Until they were, he couldn't risk sneaking to the kitchen for food. He'd lived with the Dursleys almost 10 years. 10 miserable years. As long as he could remember. Ever since he'd been a baby and his parents had died in that car crash. He couldn't remember being in the car when his parents died. Sometimes, though, when he strained his memory during long hours in a cupboard, he came up with a strange vision. A blinding, flashing green light and a burning pain in his forehead. This, he supposed, was the crash, though he couldn't imagine where all the green light came from. He couldn't remember his parents at all. His aunt and uncle never spoke about them, and of course he was forbidden to ask any questions. There were no photographs of them in the house either. When he had been younger, Harry had dreamed and dreamed of some unknown relation coming to take him away, but it had never happened. The Dursleys were his only family. Yet sometimes he thought, or maybe even hoped, that strangers in the street seemed to know him. Very strange strangers they were, too. A tiny man in a violet top hat bowed to him once while shopping with Aunt Petunia and Dudley. After asking Harry furiously if he knew the man, Aunt Petunia rushed them out of the shop without even buying anything. A wild-looking old woman dressed in all green waved merrily at him once on the bus. A bald man in a very long purple coat actually shook his hand in the street the other day and then walked away without a word. The weirdest thing about all these people was the way they seemed to vanish the second Harry tried to get a closer look. At school, Harry had no one. Everybody knew that Dudley's gang hated odd Harry Potter in his baggy old clothes and broken glasses, and nobody liked to disagree with Dudley's gang. There's our last picture. Okay, that is the end of chapter 2. will see you this week on Thursday for Chapter 3. Bye.